USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. A look at this weekend in college hockey and a review of the top news of the week.
Welcome to Weekend Review for Monday, March 29th, 2021. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. Jim, the regionals are in the bag, and we've now got 4 teams headed to the Frozen Four. Why don't we jump in region by region and talk about the games and maybe add some observations on it. It was some very entertaining hockey, but not a lot of close games. Let's start out with the Bridgeport Regional. That started out with what seemed to be probably the biggest upset of the weekend. The 4th seed Bemidji State downing Wisconsin 6-3, empty net goal late in that. But it seemed like it was Bemidji's game the whole way through.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if Cole Caulfield doesn't pop 2 in the third, that looks like an absolute rout. I mean, for a team like Bemidji that a lot of people overlooked so much of the year, Tom Serratori, take a bow, because your team deserved every ounce of credit they got when they came out of that regional. Wisconsin, I don't know. You know, who knows? It might it be the fact that you don't have a lot of NCAA tournament experience on their roster. You know, big game players that just aren't used to playing in the big games. Obviously you saw them not be able to get the job done in the Big Ten tournament final and fell behind by a huge margin, a 5-1 margin in that game as well. So I look at Wisconsin and you kind of shake your head, but it's sometimes, if you don't get the experience in those big games at the college level, it's hard to replicate. Does this help them next year? Who knows? That locker room could be cleaned out. We've already seen Cole Caulfield sign with the Canadians, but if they bring back some of these players, maybe that helps. But, for Bemidji State, you take a lot of experience out of that weekend, getting to a regional final, playing very well, really, for much of the weekend. UMass is a team that kind of can explode, and they did that in the final. But I look at this Bemidji team and Tom Serratori, what he has there, has to be very proud of his players, very proud of that team, and they showed well this weekend.
The other half of the regional semifinal had UMass and Lake Superior State. Maybe a little closer game than the 5-1 margin showed. Philly Lindbergh was terrific all weekend, but I think Lake Superior State gave the Minutemen a pretty good battle, even though they lost by a lopsided margin.
It did feel like that game was in the balance. And, when you read the quotes from Greg Carville after the weekend, UMass's coach, neither game did he sound like he was overly pleased. He didn't feel like his team played that well against Lake State, had a lot of things that he kind of was pointing out. And then on Saturday in the regional final against Bemidji, really not happy with how many penalties his team took. So talk about a perfectionist. And I guess this is a team that's kind of put itself in position to be that kind of perfect team, coming off a Frozen Four in the last tournament 2 years ago. They're back to the Frozen Four. This is a program that had never had a Frozen Four team prior. So big steps for UMass, certainly. I thought that they looked great. Both games I saw them play, I thought that they were solid. But I appreciate a coach who still is looking to find some of the fault, some of the places where he can help teach his players, knowing that there's still a lot of hockey to be played in this tournament.
I think it was impressive for UMass playing against 2 very physical teams, and in particular Bemidji, showing that not only do they have the offensive prowess, but can battle. I think that was a big plus, and probably will help them, in some people's eyes, be part of a favorite for the Frozen Four. And it was interesting, I heard Barry Melrose give Colby Cohen a little bit of guff for this comment from Colby, but he said, you know what, with the depth of this team this year, he said, I think maybe this UMass team is better than the team that had Kel McCarr 2 years ago.
There's no doubt in my mind. And listen, you can have tons of talent, and I know we'll get into this a little bit later. You can have a lot of talent. Obviously, you had Cale McCarr, you had Mario Ferraro, 2 of the best defensive players that have played college hockey in the last 10 years. And McCarr, one of the best defensemen to ever play. But the rest of that team wasn't as deep. This is a very deep team. They have 3 unbelievable lines of scoring, a top line that can really get things done. And Gusevich really proved himself this week with 4 goals. I think that this team, and I think Colby's right, is actually a better team than they were 2 years ago. Yes, you wish if you had Cale Makar with that team, he'd be a senior this year. Imagine if he was on that team. I mean, they'd be unstoppable. They might have run the table all year. But this team is focused. They seem to, they really attach to their coach and his words. And you can tell that Greg Carvel and his staff have a lot of influence on this team. They're playing loose. They're playing like they're enjoying things. And I think you go to the Frozen Four in a couple of weeks, and they will prove that they are ready to be there. They are an excellent, excellent hockey team. And I don't know if we should be picking favorites as we head to the Frozen Four, but right now they would probably be one of my favorites.
Well, let's look at the other regional that was a Friday-Saturday series. One of the games got called off when Michigan had to be bounced from the tournament for COVID protocol. So that gave Minnesota Duluth a pass to the regional final. The semifinal had North Dakota versus American International. Clearly, the Fighting Hawks were the stronger team in this. But again, this is another case where the 5-1 score maybe didn't reflect. A couple of quick goals by Jasper Weatherby and 4 goals in 8 minutes for North Dakota. Otherwise, a little bit more even feel, certainly more chances for North Dakota. AIC performed well, but at that point, you had to say, wow, North Dakota clearly a notch above the other teams in the tournament. And I think probably everybody thought that until the next night. But, again, a lot of people had been talking about should Atlantic get 2 or 3 teams in. I love that league. I've followed it for 15 years and broadcast in that league. They're a couple seasons away yet, but they're getting there.
I agree. And, you mentioned it. I think that it was a lot of shell shock that AIC got because North Dakota came out guns a-blaring. And it reminded me of their opening game in the NCHC tournament where they were playing Miami, a team they're supposed to beat, 1 versus 8 seed. This was 1 versus 16 in an NCAA tournament. And they didn't waste any time, and they found ways to score early and often. But I do agree that once you got past that 4-goal explosion to start, AIC settled in very well. And I think they actually, competed very well against North Dakota. Unfortunately, that hole is big. A 4-0 hole after 1 period is monstrous. So hats off to AIC. But, at that point, I was thinking North Dakota, this looks like the North Dakota team that went through and found a way to win the NCHC tournament. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case the next night.
Yeah, and let's talk about that final. Minnesota Duluth had a 2-0 lead until about 2 minutes left in the game. North Dakota with 2 extra attackers to tie the game and send it to overtime. And we thought maybe the game was over in the middle of that first overtime. The goal got called back by about a half an inch offside. But then one for the ages, the longest NCAA tournament game in history, and what turned out to be the 3rd longest NCAA Division I men's game in history, and a 3-2 win for Minnesota Duluth. You can't take anything away from North Dakota in it. When a game goes that long, it's going to be just about anything that causes a game winner. And man, I was really feeling for those guys. After about the second overtime, you could see that people had a lot less in the tank. Things were sloppier. Things weren't as skilled. But man, just an epic contest.
Yeah, and if you had Luke Milmuk in your pool for who was going to be the game-winning goal scorer, take a bow because nobody did. Let's face that one. I did not expect that one in the Butcher Gross overtime challenge. So, listen, those games are impossible to play. They're very, your legs, they're gone. I'm talking to Sean Richland, who played, he said he had played a triple overtime game once, and he said. After the first overtime, he said there was nothing. There's nothing left. And you're just trying to go out there. And you saw, teams were keeping shifts short. You saw the scoring chances. I'm not even talking shots, just scoring chances, grade A's. They had to have reduced, almost in half each period. If you had, 5 the first, it was probably down to 3 the second, and then it was like maybe 1 for each team if you were lucky in each overtime after that. It's very, very, very difficult to maintain that stamina, IV bags, whatever you can do between periods. But you didn't see like the start of every overtime team suddenly rejuvenated. They looked just as bad when they would come out for the first 5 minutes of the second overtime, the third overtime, the fourth overtime. It's the way it goes. And then you're just looking for somebody to make a mistake. And I don't know that there was a mistake, but the shot that ended up going in for Minnesota Duluth definitely dipped as it was getting to the goalie a little bit, got through Adam Schill's legs. And I don't know if it deflected, changed direction off the defenseman's stick a little bit. But certainly it was one for the ages, as you said. I was at the longest NCAA game 21 years ago in Albany when St. Lawrence outlasted Boston University. That was a very different game because it did seem like both of those teams had a ton of jump and were getting shots on net. I think the final shot total was somewhere around 170 plus combined shots. I'm not sure this game didn't even get to 100 shots in 5 overtimes. So a lot of difference, but that also could be a little bit of the grind that was the entire game. That was a physical game all the way. I think if you had told guys that you were going to play 8 periods that night, they might have let up on some of those hits they were throwing in the first and second period.
And there was a little bit of drama in the fourth overtime when Zach Steiskal had to leave the game with cramps, and Ryan Fanti came in. The Thunder Bay boy made 6 saves in that. Some folks might have been wondering, oh boy, you get a fresh goalie in there. Is this going to be an opportunity for North Dakota to get one? But it could be that it was an advantage to have a fresh, sharp goalie. And even though he had been sitting on the bench for 5 hours,
it didn't seem to faze him at all. And if I remember right, he took a shot within the first 90 seconds. That was a pretty high quality shot right from the slot, and just a quick flash of the glove, not even anything looking dramatic, makes the save. And then everything from there on, there was nothing that really, seemed to rattle him at all. I wouldn't recommend that as a strategy. I don't think any coach would just change their goalie, but he didn't have a choice because, like you said, the starter had cramped so badly that he didn't even look like he could move in the goal crease. So it's a gutsy call, instead of, just having your trainer go out there and do all these massages and try to get the goalie going, change him out and say, hey, we got a whole new goalie. And you don't know, you could be playing a whole nother game, and they easily could have the way that was going. That could have gone to 6, 7, 8 overtimes. There were just, the chances weren't there, but it paid off.
Well, it was a great weekend for the whole Sandelin family. We'll take a look at the Albany and Loveland regionals when we continue on Weekend Review.
This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online.
This is USCHO's Weekend Review. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. In the Albany regional, another team from the Big Ten had to step out, and that was Notre Dame. That was an earlier one than Michigan. So that meant there was only one semifinal game, and that was BU and St. Cloud State. And the Huskies really dominated BU in that contest.
They did. BU scored first early in the second. And then I think the strangest goal we'll ever see, a play behind the net where a player for St. Cloud State had the puck on his stick, but was kind of falling backwards. And I don't know if he even did it intentionally or how it happened, but ended up flipping the puck about 20 feet in the air, over his head, backwards, back toward the slot. So this went well over the goal. Nobody in the building knew where the puck was except Micah Miller, who was in the slot and basically just had an easy shot past Drew Comesso. It was one of the strangest goals we'll ever see. But that really changed momentum, and St. Cloud able to strike again quickly right after that. BU did tie it on the power play, and then St. Cloud after that a response less than 35 seconds later or so. And then that was it. BU didn't have pushback. And I think one of the biggest things for St. Cloud was their ability to take away David Ferentz and not allow him to rush the puck. And once they shut down Ferentz, that felt like it was lights out, because that was the only place that BU's offense was coming from for far too long. in terms of at least getting a rush going. Everything else was basically dump and chase. And when you're playing dump and chase against St. Cloud State, it's a losing battle. Their defensemen get back and move the puck quickly. And BU just didn't have much in terms of offense once they fell behind. And St. Cloud looked very good in that game, particularly as the game wore on. The longer that game went on, the more that they were able to dictate play.
The championship game on Sunday, St. Cloud State again prevailed 4-1 over Boston College. BC got on the board first, and then St. Cloud after that. It seemed like maybe not as strong a performance as everybody would have expected by the team that had been number one so much of the season. What was the difference in that game? Why did St. Cloud prevail so strongly?
Well, I thought that, BC kind of imposed their will in the first period. They were kind of leading in the takeaway battle, forcing St. Cloud to turn the puck over, and that led to BC's first goal. They jumped out again. St. Cloud fell behind 1-0. But in the second period, early in the period, there was a hard crash around center ice, and Easton Brodzinski, the leading scorer for St. Cloud, he had 2 goals on Saturday. He went down in a heap, and you could tell immediately that it was not just your normal knee injury. And I'm hearing, I don't have anything confirmed, but there was some tweets out there that he actually broke his femur, which is obviously, everybody knows that is a bone that does not break. It's your upper leg bone. If you think from your kind of buttocks to your knee, that bone that is in there, that's the bone that supposedly broke. I even heard reports that he did not fly back with the team. He was going to have surgery somewhere in Albany today. So thoughts out to him, but that was a rallying point for the team. There was no doubt. Not a lot of people in the building. I was across from the benches, and I could even hear the players saying, "Come on, boys, let's go. Come on, boys." And they were trying to rally themselves, and they did. And from that point on, when they got a goal off a rebound, then kind of got a greasy goal in front by Hammer, and then a third goal late in the period, and they just kind of took over. And the one thing that I think shocked everybody is that trailing 3-1, Boston College had no response in the third period. I think they ended the period with 9 shots, but by my count, the last 5 of those shots came once the goaltender was pulled, and none of them came from the grade A area. Everything was kind of a perimeter shot. So this is a good team. This is a very good St. Cloud team that when they need to do it, they can lock you down. So don't fall behind. You're Minnesota State in the Frozen Four against them. Do not fall behind, because they will lock you down and make life miserable.
Well, let's switch to the last of the 4 regionals, and that was out in Loveland, Colorado. And man, it looked like it was going to be 7 years in a row for Minnesota State not making it past the first round. Very late in that contest, when the Mavericks were able to cut it to a 3-2 lead and then come up with the extra attacker goal, which was just terrific. Jake Livingstone just going end to end and flipping a pass from behind the net right out onto the doorstep to Cade Borchardt to tie the game with about a minute left. And then Ryan Sandelin, being Johnny on the spot, having to wrestle his way away from having his stick held and being held down, and spotting the puck laying there in the crease while Keith Petruzzelli was looking around to see where it was, just jamming it home for the win. That was just huge for Minnesota State, and certainly great for Mike Hastings. 7 times would have been the number for the team. 5 of the 6 times not getting past the first round were under Mike Hastings' time behind the bench, and that just seemed to take the monkey off the back of the Mavericks.
It certainly did, and they played with so much more confidence in the regional final. But you credit that team. Quinnipiac has been a team that has been hard to score against at times. Keith Petruzzelli, a Hobie Baker finalist in goal. But they did not give up, and they found ways to rally. And then, the game-winning goal in overtime by Sandelin was absolute proof to play to the whistle. And I was mentioned to somebody as we watched the replay of that one, I don't know if I was the referee, if I could have held my whistle long enough to realize that the puck was still free. The puck was always free, but if you look at where the referee was, the goaltender was between him and the puck. So hats off to whoever the official was that was behind the net in that one for not blowing the whistle. Easily, I would say 9 times out of 10, you get an inadvertent whistle. Instead, the play goes on. Petrozelli kind of loses track of where the puck is. It's not under his pad when he thought it was. It was just next to his pad, and Sandelin jumps in, and that became a pretty good night for the Sandelin family. His dad wins in 5 overtimes. He is the overtime game winner. Ended up being the most outstanding player in that regional as well. What a night, and could set up something a couple of weeks from now in Pittsburgh that has a lot of family pride on the line.
The other half of the semifinals in the Loveland Regional was Minnesota and Omaha, and Minnesota got off to a 3-1 lead in the first period and never seemed to look back.
I was kind of surprised. This and the Wisconsin game were the two that I think I was shocked just at the way the game played out. The fact that Minnesota jumped out so early, that Omaha had no response at all, and then ended up being on the wrong side of a lopsided score. And there were a lot of lopsided scores this weekend. We know that. But at that point, I'm just thinking, hey, Minnesota, no problem. They'll take on Minnesota State. They've got so much momentum on their side. Didn't have to overly, work too hard to get a win with such a lopsided victory. Well, maybe they had to work a little harder than we thought, because I thought that on Sunday in the regional final, they just didn't have it. And that's when Minnesota State, and you put a goaltender like Dryden McKay out there. And he had such gaudy numbers early in the season. I think at one point we talked about his goals against was somewhere around 0.8 or 0.6. I mean, far less than a goal a game. I think he had at that point like 6 shutouts and 8 starts. Things were going well. But then as the season went on, you saw, 3 goals against. I think he had a 4 goals against once. Gets, lost in the conference tournament. And you kind of shaking your head and say, maybe McKay's not that good. Well, put McKay on the biggest stage as he was Sunday night in the regional finals, and he proved. And, his defense was solid in front of him. He made the stops he needs to make. And it's why he's back now, I think, in the national conversation. We're talking more about Dryden McKay probably on Monday morning after a regional than we did for the last month.
Minnesota State's performance against Minnesota was very much like Bemidji State against Wisconsin, where it was just driving, attacking, playing systems, playing good defense, staying in your game. Everything that Mike Hastings wanted out of his squad, he got, just like Tom Serratori did in that game against Wisconsin. And I think maybe it answers some questions that some people had about why did the WCHA get 3 teams in. Minnesota State has as good a chance of anybody of winning the national championship right now. They're going to have time to prepare for their game coming up, and they are going to be able to put some systems in place specifically for their opponents. That's part of it here in the regionals. You have the time to prepare for a team, and the Mavericks just executed nearly flawlessly against Minnesota. You mentioned the goalies, and this might lead us into some of the points we wanted to talk about in general. McKay, LaFontaine, Knight, the 3 finalists for the Richter Award. The vote's already been taken on that, so this weekend doesn't influence it. But McKay comes out of the weekend 2-0, picks up his 10th shutout. And you talk about a defense playing in front of him. That's a huge part of why he's been so successful. Not to take anything away from him, but when you have defenders who lessen the chances of the opponent and give the goalie something to square up on, all weekend you saw how he's able to play outside the crease to cut down a shot because his defenders, his back-checking forwards are there to cut down the angles and cut down the opportunities. A successful goalie allows you to do that, and that system allows your goalie to be successful. It's one hand washing the other. I was thoroughly impressed with him all weekend. Also, how unflappable he is in net. So, taking away from that, if he ends up being the Richter Award winner, I think it's highly deserved.
Yeah, and I like you mentioned that. I believe, and I'm on the voting committee. We were given a ballot last week, and I believe it was to vote for the winner, and similar to the Hobie, the top 3 vote getters end up being listed as finalists. I believe that's the way it goes. So the ballot's probably already in. I think it might be a little more difficult for him to win because, as I mentioned, for the last month we've been talking a little bit less about Dryden McKay, a little bit more about Spencer Knight, a little bit more about Jack LaFontaine. I think that, and I had said this back on a podcast, I think in January, and I had somebody in the college hockey world come up to me and say, "You're crazy." And I had said how good he was. Now, that was when he was on that run of, 6 shutouts in 8 games, I think it was. And his goals against was low. His save percentage was high. And they said, "Oh, he's playing." And look, he's playing the WCHA. That's maybe the worst conference out there. Well, we learned that the WCHA was not the worst conference out there this weekend. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that was a very good conference, and the teams that got in. Yes, there were some bottom feeders in that conference. So there's bottom feeders in most conferences. Maybe not the NCHC, Big Ten, maybe a little bit less, but there's bottom feeders out there, and every team's going to get some wins against some of the bottom of the conference. That's why there's a top. That's why there's a bottom. But what Dryden McKay was able to do throughout the season was really kind of magnified, I think, at the regional and specifically on Sunday. And he might not get any credit at the end of this thing, but the reality is he has the chance out of those 3 goaltenders and out of really the Hobie Baker finalists to be, holding a national championship trophy when all is said and done.
A couple other interesting things out of the weekend. Only 2 one-goal games, and those were the 2 overtime games. Things were a lot more lopsided than I thought, and I know some people were complaining that maybe it wasn't as exciting as it might have been. But there was also a lot of scoring in this, too. As I was looking at my completely busted bracket, thanks to North Dakota in Minnesota in this, which was half of my bracket. I got the other half right for the Frozen Four. But even the tiebreaker of goals scored is going to be a lot higher than a lot of people picked. Very high scoring, very high average per game coming out of that.
Well, the good part was that most people picked their total score in our bracket based on the 15-game schedule. There'll only be 13 played by the end, and that's as long as we don't have any more COVID outbreaks. So maybe the average it'll average out. But you're right, the scoring was way up, and it's not always easy to explain that. I always think that teams get more into lockdown modes this time of year, but I feel like teams were opening things up, and that was what there was some. Some wide open hockey at times in some of these games. And I think you saw a lot of grit and determination of other teams, and that can be a big part of it as well. But I look at this weekend, and I think one of my biggest takeaways, and maybe this was going to be your next point, but I'll kind of jump into it, is that age and experience matter. And we look at the 4 teams that are in the Frozen Four. And I was trying to pull it up before we got on the air of who the oldest teams are. I know the 2 youngest teams, Boston College and Boston University, they were both bounced by the same team, St. Cloud State, one of the older teams, at least in the top third in terms of oldest teams. I know UMass has some pretty good young players, but they're one of the older teams in the country. Same can be said for Minnesota Duluth. Same can be said for Minnesota State. So we look at some of the younger teams, Michigan, Wisconsin, Boston College, Boston University, even Minnesota. Some of these teams, it's hard not to take the flashy young guys, but there has to be, I think, especially when it comes to NCAA tournament time, some sort of a balance where you have some really high-end young talent, but some really experienced, physically older players to balance out your roster. I think we've seen this in the past, but it really was on display this weekend, where I thought that the older, more experienced teams were able to handle some of those young, flashy players and young, flashy teams.
If you were going to establish a game where you're going to try to bottle up the middle and you're going to try to work hard along the boards, the physical advantage a 23 or 24-year-old player is going to have against a 19 or 20-year-old player is really going to come to the surface. And indeed, I think that's what we saw. When you look at these teams in the Frozen Four, you have St. Cloud State and Minnesota State in one regional, and you have Minnesota Duluth and UMass, a rematch of the 2019 final in the other regional. you're going to have some teams that can really get out there and battle. There may be a little advantage offensively for UMass, maybe a little bit for St. Cloud State, but I'm looking forward to some really physical, grinding, hard-hitting hockey out of both of those semifinals coming up on April 8th.
Yeah, well, St. Cloud State, you're going to have to think about, they've got a big hole now to fill with Brodzinski out. He'll definitely not be playing. We know that. UMass, you're right. They have a couple of really good lines there that can get up and down the ice. They have some speed, but they play tough. They play heavy. They're one of the heavier teams in Hockey East, and thus probably one of the heavier teams in the country. And then I think every one of these four teams, you can kind of say that same thing. They play pretty heavy hockey. This will not be a display of skating and beautiful rushes. Two back-to-back track meets. I think this, in my opinion, will be two semifinals where both of these teams are just gritting it out and battling it and trying to find ways to win pucks, lose pucks. There'll be some greasy goals in front. I like that style of hockey, and I think if you watch the NHL when it comes to the Stanley Cup playoffs, usually that's what you're seeing is that kind of grittier hockey. Sure, you have some high-end superstars in that league that can get open and just score goals, but usually it's a tough goal in front of the net, a rebound. Maybe it's a third whack. Maybe it's whatever it may be. It's not usually going to be a bunch of 3-on-1s and breakaways. And that's usually kind of what defines the Frozen Four. And we can go back, to recent champions. I think both Duluth's teams were kind of gritty. I thought that North Dakota was one of those grittier teams. Denver had a lot of flash to them, but you go back to like Union, you go back to Yale. Providence. I thought, there's always some sort of offensive talent. You can't win a championship without some players that can put pucks in the net. But man, every one of those teams has one trait in that they play some pretty gritty, physical hockey and can find ways to protect leads and play hard when the game is on the line.
Well, I'm with you. I enjoy that type of hockey too. Lastly, it's going to bring up some interesting first in a long time. 3 of the 4 teams have never won a national championship, UMass, St. Cloud, and Minnesota State. And Minnesota Duluth has a chance to be the first 3-time in a row winner since the 1951 to 1953 Michigan Wolverines. So that's been a while there too.
And the other one I'll throw in there, you haven't had 3 teams from the same state. Obviously, we have 3 teams from Minnesota in this Frozen Four since 1992, when you had Lake Superior, Michigan, and Michigan State. It's really, those are 3 very interesting storylines right there alone. And then there'll be some great ones with players. Obviously, father son with the Sandelins. That would be unbelievable if you ended up with Minnesota State and Minnesota Duluth in the finals. Not just a battle of the state of Minnesota, but then the battle of the Sandelin family, which I wonder where mom sits in the middle of that one.
Boy, I think she sits with Ryan on that one, but I don't want to presuppose. Well, it's going to be a great Frozen Four. We look forward to bringing you all kinds of coverage of that at USCHO.com. And I think we'll wrap it here. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Weekend Review Podcast, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit USCHO.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.